if you swear on these sacred relics of Bayeux Cathedral and then you go back on your oath, ultimately you will come a cropper and you'll die a horrible death in battle, and that's your comeuppance.
The year 1066 is the most famous date in English history, when William of Normandy defeated Harold II of England and won himself a crown and the epithet the Conqueror. But there is a lot more to it than just one bloody battle at Hastings. You'll find half a century of invasion and political manoeuvring before it, and decades of brutal subjugation afterwards. Medieval historian Marc Morris is an expert in the subject. His books include The Norman Conquest and The Anglo-Saxons, and in this 4-part podcast series he talks to me, David Musgrove, about the full story of the Norman Conquest. So welcome to 1066, the battle for England. This is episode 2, The Godwins, the power behind the Anglo-Saxon throne. We left things in the last episode with Edward the Confessor, the King of England, struggling to maintain control and struggling to find an heir to succeed him. This episode, we're going to take on the story through the 1050s and the 1060s up to 1066. So welcome back to the early 1050s. Mark, remind us what's going on.
Well, Edward the Confessor had banished the Godwin family, the most powerful family by a very long chalk in England, in 1051. But in 1052, they came roaring back and put him in his place and reinstated his queen, Edith, to the royal bedchamber. I think, as we said in the previous episode, there is an acceptance by this point generally among the political elite that this marriage, this royal marriage, is never going to produce any children. So they try and come up with a plan B. And what they do in the first instance, in the early and mid-1050s, is they go right back to the start of episode 1 and they start looking for long-lost relatives of Edward the Confessor. And you'll remember that there was a son of Ethelred the Unready called Edmund Ironside, who was king for a few months, who had very young children, who we're told were sent out. You sort of said, they escaped. Well, no, they didn't escape. They were sent by King Canute, we're told, to Sweden in secret to be disappeared, to be done in. And the King of Sweden sort of thought, no, I'm not in the infanticide business. And he sort of sent them on to Hungary. So however much of that story is kind of true or not, these young boys ended up in Hungary where they grew to manhood. One of them dies, Edmund's namesake son, but the other one, Edward, grows to manhood, marries a Hungarian lady, aristocratic lady, and the knowledge of the existence of this potential heir evidently reaches the ears of the English court in the 1050s, and there are repeated attempts to communicate with him, because he's on the other side of Europe, to persuade him to come back. Missions are sent, and they only get a certain way and then they collapse. But eventually, he does come back in the spring of 1057.
And it doesn't pan out too well for him, does it?
No, as soon as he's off the boat, practically, he drops dead.
Why is that?
Well, it'd be lovely if the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle said, here's what I've heard. But he says, we do not know for what reason he was not allowed to see his kinsman, King Edward. Now, that to me sounds like Edward didn't have much of a say in it. He wasn't allowed to see King Edward. Maybe King Edward said, no, I don't want to see him. Or maybe some other dark forces did him in. I mean, it's in all of this, we should say, clearly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is hinting at foul play. We don't know why he wasn't allowed to see him. He doesn't say he caught a cold and then very sadly he died. He clearly implies that there was some machinations going on. The difficulty with that is, though, that Edward the Exile, as he's been dubbed in modern historiography to distinguish him from his relative, the king, is that he himself had children who start to appear in the record. So we have his son Edgar, who from this point on is a potential heir to his great-uncle, Edward the Confessor. Edgar Etheling, as he starts to be styled in English sources, like, occasional sort of fleeting entry wherever he's mentioned. Etheling signifying that he is throne-worthy, that he's, is of sufficient nobility to inherit the throne. So after decades of uncertainty, or not decades, but after a decade of uncertainty, it seems by the late 1050s that there is a descendant of the old royal line ready to step into Edward's shoes when he goes.
Yeah. And I'm a great enthusiast for Edgar Atheling, and I feel that the Bayeux Tapestry does him a great disservice by not featuring him in the story. But we'll come back to that, I'm sure.
There may be reasons that the Normans chose not to foreground him.
It is possible. So is it the case that Edgar was acknowledged by all and sundry as the man to take over from Edward the Confessor?
Well, this is the thing. If he was, nobody bothered to tell us about it. So, the fact that he is dignified with his title Atheling, you really have to scrape around to find the sources that say that. What you don't have to scrape around to find is the unstoppable rise of the Godwin family. So we said that the Godwin family return in 1052. Godwin himself, he dies the following year. So he's only been back a few months, and he has a stroke, it seems, during a royal feast and dies a few hours later. But he is succeeded as Earl of Wessex by his son, Harold Godwinson.
Yep.
And then very, very quickly, in the sort of 5 years that follow, as earldoms fall vacant, they go, in some instances, not to the heirs of the previous, not to the sons of the previous holder, but to a Godwinson. And famously, in the case of Northumbria in 1055, we have Tostig, one of Harold's younger brothers, and by the late 1050s, two other brothers, the Leofwin and Gurth, have got commands in East Anglia and in the southeast. So, with one major exception, which is the earldom of Mercia, which is hedged around on all sides by Godwins, England is approximating a one-party state. It's not quite there, but they clearly have the whip hand. And of course, the Godwin's daughter Edith is still the queen. So in those circumstances, the question of who is going to succeed Edward the Confessor when he dies, is it going to be this, half Hungarian child that's shown up, who's literally is only a child in the late 1050s? He's not out of his first decade.
Yeah.
Or is it going to be one of these powerful, powerful men whose praises are sung to the skies in the Life of King Edward, which is commissioned by Edward's queen Edith, about her brothers, Harold and Tostig? They are portrayed as supermen, rulers in waiting in this tract, which seems to be a very clear indication that the desired outcome from the Godwin point of view is that one of them succeeds.
Yeah, now that is very interesting. So obviously we know, it's not too much of a spoiler to know that Harold does actually succeed down the track. But we got Tostig. I'm never sure if it's Tosti or Tostig. Whenever I've spoken to other people, they take the G off. But we'll go with Tostig.
Tostig. I'm easy.
They were both notable figures. Did Tostig have a sort of a similar claim to the throne as Harold might have done?
Well, you see, none of these. This is the great thing about 1066. People will often say, and you may have it in your list of questions further down the line, who has the best claim? And the answer is none of them have a good claim.
That's the next question.
This is the next question. Well, the best claim from the 9th century onwards, at least, is you are part of the Old English royal family. People have this ludicrous idea that the English kingship is elective. You still see this trotted out on newspapers and on game shows and such. The answer, how did you become king in the 11th century? Oh, you were elected. And yet when you look at the family tree, you go right back to Alfred the Great's grandfather, Egbert, and you just go, well, that goes father, son, 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 son. Then, they didn't have any sons, brother, son, son, son. And even when the Danes take over, so Canute takes over by violence, and that's very clear, they don't sort of say, well, who should follow Canute? Obviously, it's be one of his sons, So it is a hereditary monarchy, and it has been for centuries. That is your best claim. The problem is, what happens when you have a king who has no very clear family members, has no male relatives who are going to step in. So that's why it becomes very desperate in the 1050s, because that line is dying, and they're trying to. There's certainly a faction at court that is trying to rekindle it, nurture it back into life. But there's a very strong sense of kind of this era is over, because remember, we've had that Danish conquest half a century earlier, 40 years earlier, and we've already said this has destroyed or upturned the existing ruling class, who are in many cases offshoots of the old royal family. And you have newcomers like Godwin, and they owe nothing to the royal family. They are creations of King Canute. They are half Scandinavians. Remember, Godwin married a Scandinavian relative of Canute, his sister-in-law. The Godwinsons themselves are half Scandinavian. So there's a sense of what do we owe to this dynasty that's on its last legs? And there's a sense, I think, of a bit like the time when the Carolingians took over from the Merovingians. They are clearly, Tosti and Harold, mayors of the palace. That's the way they are portrayed, as running the kingdom on behalf of this increasingly elderly, confused, pious old man who's happier with his hounds and his dogs and his prayers than actually doing the hard business of ruling. And the implication in all of this is they're ready to step in and take over when he's gone.
Okay, so we've got contenders ready. Edgar Effling, perhaps. Harold, Tostig. What's William doing? William of Normandy.
Well, I mean, William of Normandy enters this story. So William of Normandy, the only time that he's been involved in this story up to this point is 1051, when we're told by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that he crosses to talk with his kinsman, King Edward, about a subject we don't know what.
Yep.
And we might infer from later sources that what was discussed was the succession. What William's doing after that, is basically ruling Normandy and fighting with his neighbours and establishing his supremacy in northern France. So he's got other fish, bigger fish to fry, or not bigger fish, but more immediate fish to fry. What happens that throws everything into relief in the mid-1060s is Harold Godwinson goes to Normandy. And this is where the story gets really famous and well known, because that is the beginning of the Bayeux Tapestry.
Yes. So let's talk about that for a second, because that is clearly an important thing. So the Bayeux Tapestry basically starts.
Well, people write books on it. It's
They do, don't they?
They do,
to popular acclaim. So the tapestry starts with Harold. Well, it starts with Edward the Confessor having a chat with Harold, and then Harold riding off to Bosham. Bosham again. What's going on with Bosham? Why is that such an important?
Well, it's
place?
clearly just a very important Godwin manor, and as I said, it's possible. It's not provable, but it's possible that Godwin's father was a Sussex thane called Wulfnoth, who kind of goes rogue in Ethelred the Unready's reign. So it may be that Bosham is kind of like the ancestral manse, Although the Godwins end up ruling vast swathes of England everywhere, this seems to be sort of one of the places they think of as home and one of their power bases.
Why would Harold want to go to Normandy in 1063?
Well, this is the $1,000 question, because any number of reasons are given. His trip is not mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It's clearly one of those occasions, again, where the Chronicle goes, shum, don't talk about that. Because it's so compromising. What happens is very, very bad for Harold. So why does he go? And let's just kick into touch immediately the later suggestions, because William of Malmesbury, writing in the early 12th century, said some English people say he just went fishing. Okay, some people say that Elvis is living on the moon. He's just saying this is something that common people say, but it's clearly I think. And then there's other sort of scholars in recent decades have said, well, perhaps he was going to the continent for some other reason and was blown off course. I don't think any of that is implied by our sources. I'll cut to the chase. I think the best explanation of why Harold goes is provided by a post-conquest chronicler who's English, called Eadmer of Canterbury. And I say that because, one, he's very well informed on the detail, and two, on the sort of the political detail, but he's also well informed on sort of like the minutiae. Like he says, well, they were blown off course and they ended up going up this particular river, and you go, oh yeah, that's where it is. So he also knows the names. I'll come on to this is a point I'll come on to. Harold has kinsmen at the Norman court being held hostage by Duke William of Normandy, future William the Conqueror. He is the person who supplies the names of those hostages. So Eadmer is very well informed. Later Norman chroniclers say he went to promise the throne on behalf of Edward the Confessor, which would be incredibly convenient, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I think that's the point where you have to say, come on, because Harold is the most powerful man in the kingdom, arguably more powerful than the king himself, who's a broken reed by this point.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that Edward the Confessor was in a position to compel Harold to do anything that was inimical to his own interests is for the birds.
Mm-hmm.
But if Harold is, I know there's a lot of if here, but bear with me for a second. If Harold is seriously thinking about the throne, and all the indications are that he is very seriously, by the mid-1060s, everyone's looking at Edward the Confessor, who's now into his 60s,
mm-hmm.
thinking he's not going to last forever. And Harold is seriously thinking about replacing him. The big stumbling block from him is that William the Conqueror has 2 of his kinsmen hostage. And what's going to happen to those people if Harold takes the throne? And if nothing else, even if he says, well, I was never particularly close to my nephew or my youngest brother, Wulfnoth, even if he makes that decision, it's shameful to him to have these family members being held hostage from one year to the next at a foreign court. So I think, bearing in mind that Eadmer says he goes with, great treasure, etc., that he goes to basically negotiate his way out of this and to buy back the hostages. And William isn't selling. He gets one back. He gets his nephew back, the least valuable one, but William retains Harold's brother Wulfnoth, and in the process actually strengthens his claim to the throne by having Harold swear to uphold William's claim when the time comes.
Now, so that is the centre point of the tapestry, isn't it?
Yep.
That famous scene where
Yep.
Harold is stretching awkwardly between reliquaries and appearing to give an oath. Though the tapestry, as with all things, is a little bit vague about what he's actually doing.
Yeah.
So actually we should just preface it. So Harold and William have just been on a campaign in Brittany fighting together. Harold has shown manly virtues and saved some Norman soldiers from drowning in the River Cunon and generally been a bit of a heroic sort.
Yeah.
And then, before he's allowed to go home, by the looks of things, William enforces some promise on him.
Yeah. I think everything you've said, I think people will always say, the Bayeux Tapestry is propaganda. Yes, we've said all the sources are propaganda, but it's very well-informed propaganda. And you mentioned that campaign to Brittany. The detail there is very compelling. Why you've got Harold behaving heroically and rescuing soldiers, etc. The thing that most people miss, or popularly miss, should we say, about the Bayeux Tapestry, as you'll know, is people often say, it's the story of the Norman conquest. No, it isn't. It's the story of King Harold. It's the story of Harold Godwinson. It begins with Harold Godwinson setting off for Normandy. The hinge in the narrative is him swearing his oath, right in the middle, and it ends with Harold's death. And the oath, uniquely in the tapestry, is sworn at Bayeux, on the relics, presumably, that held by Bayeux Cathedral. So if the tapestry has a message, it's kind of like, however great you are and brilliant you are, and this man was a hero. He rescued Norman soldiers. He's a brilliant campaigner, a brilliant fighter. If you swear on these sacred relics of Bayeux Cathedral, and then you go back on your oath, ultimately you will come a cropper, and you'll die a horrible death in battle, and that's your comeuppance. So it's the sort of the rise and fall of Harold Godwinson. The Norman conquest is kind of like just almost incidental to the plot. I think the tapestry, taken in conjunction with other sources, tells a credible tale. Yes, there are bits that are distorted or twisted, but it chimes very well with what Eadmer tells us. And Eadmer is, remember, English, writing from the other side. Eadmer is absolutely the conquest is the biggest disaster ever to befall England. Absolutely wrecks his world. He's born slightly before 1066, and he's nostalgic for the world that's gone. But nevertheless, his account chimes very happily with that pro-Norman account that is the Bayeux Tapestry. So, I think that to sum up, Harold goes to try and recover his kinsman, thinks that William will be someone he can strike a deal with, and actually ends up digging himself deeper into the hole as regards the succession, in that he's made to swear to uphold William's claim when Edward dies, which is not very far away now.
No, and that does cause a problem, doesn't it? I just want to take a pause for a second, just thinking about oaths, because I often wonder about this, about men making oaths in this period. you've written the book on the Anglo-Saxons. I expect there was a lot of oaths made in that period as well. How important was it? I mean, obviously, in the course of this story, it's an important propaganda tool for the Normans to justify what's going on. But were people, was it a real thing that people did, and was it important, and did it matter if people broke oaths?
Well, I mean, I say this having never written a paper on oaths or studied it in the round, but yes, they do them all the time, and it's a way that sort of, it's one of the things that binds society together is, you're swearing before God in order to do that you're going to do or not do something. And so, yes, it's very important, because if you break that oath, then it's going to have the consequence will be divine retribution, not just people saying, oh, he's an oath breaker. And so, it's a way that treaties between rulers are agreed. An unusual thing that happens in Normandy in 1064 or whenever it was with Harold. It's unusual. The only unusual thing about it is we have a contemporary artist illustrating it. Yeah.
Okay, so in the Bayeux Tapestry narrative, Harold swears this oath and then manages to get back to England out of the clutches of Williams, but presumably with this thing looming in the background now that he's made some sort of promise. So let's go back to what's going on in England in the 1060s. How are the Godwin family doing generally? How's Tostig doing in Northumbria? Is he making friends?
Well, this is a very loaded question. In general terms, they're doing fine. Yeah. They continue to be the most powerful force with no exception. The reason you mentioned Tostig, I think, is because Tostig pushes his luck too far in 1065, and in the autumn of 1065 there is a great rising in the north against Tostig Godwinson. And Tostig, we should say, although he has a Scandinavian name like his older brother Harold, someone once wisely said that was the only Scandinavian thing about him. Is by upbringing and political education, he's a southerner, and he's imposed on the north. And according to sort of the pro-Godwin sources, he's brilliant. But even though the pro-Godwin source, The Life of King Edward, says, sometimes he's a little bit too zealous in punishing wrongdoers, it's a strong indication that he'd gone in and tried to sort of bully the North or tax them into submission, or somehow he'd been too heavy-handed, and there's a very broad uprising, not just against Tostig, I think, but against the whole the Godwin clan. And it involves the sons of the late Earl of Mercia, Elfgar, whose names for famous characters, they become Edwin and Morcar. So these very young brothers, probably in their late teens. One of whom, the Northumbrian rebels, Tostig is not there. Tostig is an absentee ruler, but the Northumbrians rise up and massacre Tostig's men, not just in York, but all over the north. And they install as their new chosen Earl Morcar, who is the younger of the two brothers. Mercia has gone to his older brother Edwin, but the key point here is they're both kids. They're both teenagers. Yeah. But they are supported by this backlash against Godwin rule in the north. They're supported by the rulers of Wales, the many sort of varied rulers of Wales. So everybody, and we should say in passing that Harold and Tostig have gone to town on Wales in 1063. They've basically invaded Wales and subdued it. So everybody basically who has suffered in recent years from the rise of the Godwins now are rising up against the Godwins in the autumn of 1065. And the Northumbrians and the Mercians, they march down as far as Oxford before they agree to stop and go home.
Yeah. So this is a dangerous situation. Edward the Confessor, he's king. He stamps his authority on the situation.
Well, no, you see, this is you're being ironic, because what Edward says, we're told, is you should crush this, and the person who says no is Harold, who just goes to prove that Harold is in a position to chart his own course, to say no, I'm not going to do that. What he does is he says he makes peace with these rebels and says, we'll sort it, go home, stand down, and the price for this is accepting his brother's exile, not just his demotion, but the price that the rebels demand is Tostig leave the realm and never come back. And Harold says okay, which is absolutely crucial in the year that follows, because There was a brilliant line. I forget who said it now, but said the family that slays together stays together. But this falling out by these two brothers who had fought side by side in Wales the previous year. Now their falling out is kind of the family's undoing in what follows. But in terms of 1065. Tostig very reluctantly goes into exile. Harold patches up a peace with the rulers of the Midlands and the North, and Edward the Confessor gets very ill. We're told he's distressed about the whole situation, and he clearly has some either mental or physical episode which begins his final decline.
Yeah. So as you said earlier, he's in his 60s by now.
Yeah, he's either 60 or just a bit older.
Yeah. Has he been an effective ruler?
I think given the hand he was dealt, which is he starts with no affinity. He starts with a cluster of people, a clutch of people he's brought over from Normandy, but he doesn't have any power base and he hasn't been in England for a quarter of a century. I think he acquits himself very well for the first half of his reign. And my personal opinion from the sources is that he doesn't have any say in what goes on in the second half of his reign. Maybe he gets some say in church appointments. But my opinion is once the Godwins come back, they are running the show. I can't think they would allow him any serious political power after what had happened. It's kind of like give him an inch. What happened last time? He was taking the initiative and then he turned on us and banished us. So again, it's like a repeat of the 1040s. I've already said I think the notion that he was okay with and was prepared to bury the hatchet with the killing of his younger brother. I think again, when in the 1050s, the notion that he's kind of like, I think he might have been resigned. But I think he's just kind of wearing a paper crown. Mm-hmm. He's king. There's a very good quote, I forget, from someone writing after the conquest, but closely contemporary, that says he was king in name alone, and that the Godwin brothers were ruling his realm. And that's the impression you get given as well by the life of King Edward. So I think he is, he's a rubber stamp from 1052 onwards.
So if that's true and the Godwin brothers are sort of de facto rulers, then this falling out between the two of them in 1065 is pretty seismic.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the sources that kind of tells us what Harold thought about that? Was he at all bothered about doing the dirty on his brother, or was he actually doing it in order to cement his position?
I think it has to be realpolitik on Harold's part. There's no suggestion prior to this point that they'd been anything other than close and had gotten on well. I mean, that's the impression given by the life of King Edward. And the life of King Edward absolutely laments their falling out. Alas, those brothers' hearts too hard, it says at one point. So they're it's absolutely critical in terms of what followed.
So 1065, getting towards the end of that year, Edward the Confessor, not very well. Still no clear, obvious line of succession, though perhaps people are thinking that Harold is the man. Perhaps that's the case. We'll get back to that in a second. I just wonder, in the upper echelons of English society, what would those people have been thinking about the possibility of a foreign ruler coming in? Someone, obviously we've had a period of Viking rule, so now there's a chance that there will be someone else come in. Would they have wanted an English ruler to be the successor?
I think so. I mean, so you're talking about, what are people? Who do people think? Who would they like to be king? I think there are basically two factions or persuasions, if you like, within England. I think there must be a group of people. Perhaps I say this because the bishops were involved in getting Edward the Exile back, but the people who are in a sense like the people who were looking for a legal precedent, who said we have a perfectly valid candidate here. His name is Edgar, and he is the Etheling, and he has the best right. And that's something that is said long after the conquest, by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, as was his right, kind of thing. But as I've already kind of said, does Team Godwin care about that? And Team Godwin is really powerful by this point. The number of men that Harold has personally commended to him, his kind of affinity, if you like, runs into the thousands. The Archbishop of Canterbury, we haven't really talked about the Archbishop of Canterbury, who we said that the succession dispute for Canterbury that kicked off in 1050 was actually resolved in the end when the Godwins came back by putting a Godwin man in, Stigand. He too is really, really powerful and has thousands of commended men. So not only do the Godwin family have most of the earldoms sewn up and in their power, they also have the church on their side. So really, kind of by the mid-1060s, all their ducks are in a row. And are they going to say, well, but fair play, this guy's about 11 or 12, he has a better claim than us on paper, on parchment? I don't think so. So I think all of those people who have hitched their wagon to Harold in the past 15, 20 years are now sort of thinking, our man's time has come, and I think it would have been a very brave person who stood up and said, actually, I think you'll find Edgar has the better claim to any of the people in that affinity, because it's so strong and it's so broadly based.
Yeah. And we haven't talked about Harold's sister Edith very much for a bit. Might we imagine, to remind listeners, she's married to Edward the Confessor. Might we imagine that she's kind of a bit of a whispering power behind the throne?
That's more than that. I mean, the impression you're given by the tract she commissioned, I keep coming back to this, The Life of King Edward, is we're told that she arranged the choreography of the court. She was the one who dressed Edward up for royal occasions. He would have been happier, just left to his dogs and his prayers and just minding his own business. But she was the power behind the throne in that sense. Choreographing things at court. So I think she has a major role. The question that is unclear from that source is where her loyalties lay with regards to her brothers. So was she hoping for some situation where both brothers ruled as kind of, keepers of the kingdom until, such time? Was she favouring Tostig? I mean, I think Tostig and Harold are praised to the skies, but Harold even more so. Harold is the Superman of that story. So, but it's hard to say when they fall out where Edith's loyalties lay. We're certainly told she was very upset. I think it says, that line I quoted about, alas, those brothers' hearts too hard. Yeah. We're told this tale will not please the Queen, But my strong impression is that the plan, such as it was that Harold was going to take over and that Tostig would have been his right-hand man.
Yeah.
And I think maybe Tostig would have been okay with that. If Tostig was left to sort of say, you rule the north, and I will take the crown, I think he'd have been fine. The problem was that Harold agreed to a plan in which Tostig gets nothing. Tostig is gone forever, has to remain in exile. Perhaps, further down the line, Harold thought, well, maybe I can reintroduce him, after a period of political exile. But that wasn't what was agreed. And Tostig is clearly beyond furious about it. He's bent on revenge.
Yeah. And we will come back to that revenge in the next episode. But before we do, I'm just wondering, so we've talked about the situation in England. Over in Normandy, might we imagine that William is sat on his ducal throne thinking, that all makes sense. Harold's the best man to be king in England?
No, clearly not. I mean, if we're going with the tapestry story and the Admiral of Canterbury, William thinks that he now has buttressed his claim to the throne, that may have gone back, 14 years to 1051. But I'm sure, one of the things you realise as a medievalist after a bit of looking at the source material is just how quickly news travels, especially when it's by ship. So within 24 hours of Edward the Confessor catching a cold, that news would reach William the Conqueror's ears. So as soon as people start to say, he's not looking at all well, and that news leaks out of the English court, that news will very quickly reach William's ears. So William must have been in anticipation. Everybody in both England and at the ducal court of Normandy, if not across Normandy, would have been on tenterhooks waiting to see what happened when Edward the Confessor finally died.
And that is an excellent point to leave it, because we will finish this episode with Edward getting ready to die, shall we say. Nothing's settled. There's clearly going to be some trouble. We will take on 1066 in the next episode, and things are going to get messy.